All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Ready for another philosophical head scratcher?
Oh, always. Bring it on.
Okay, so today we're diving into this concept from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's called consequentializing, and it's all about how different moral theories, the different ways we think about right and wrong, might actually be more connected than they seem. It's like a secret decoder ring for understanding ethics.
Yeah, think of it like this. You've got all these different systems for making moral decisions, some based on consequences, some on rules, some on virtues. Consequentializing asks if we can take all these different systems and reinterpret them through the lens of just one, focusing solely on the outcomes of our actions.
So instead of having to learn every single ethical theory, consequentializing offers a shortcut to understanding the connections between them, right?
Exactly. It's about seeing if we can rebuild these theories from the ground up using just one core principle. The best action is the one that leads to the best results.
So for all of you out there who want to level up your philosophical game without getting bogged down in all the technical jargon, this deep dive is for you. By the end, you'll be able to see how even seemingly different moral approaches might be more similar than you think. You might even have a few aha moments along the way.
And that's what makes this concept so powerful. It helps us unpack complex ethical debates and potentially spot common ground or hidden assumptions. We're going to break it down into digestible chunks so you can grasp these core ideas without feeling overwhelmed.
Okay, let's start with the basics. What exactly is consequentializing? Can we break it down into plain English?
Sure. Imagine you have a moral rule like don't lie. That's a rule-based approach. Consequentializing is basically asking, could we arrive at that same rule by just thinking about the consequences of lying? Instead of saying lying is inherently wrong, we'd say it's wrong because it leads to worse outcomes compared to telling the truth.
So it's not about abandoning the rule, but about seeing if we can justify it based on the results of our actions.
Precisely. And the key to this whole idea is a framework called Act-Consequentialism. It's actually pretty simple. Act-Consequentialism says the right thing to do in any situation is the action that produces the best overall outcome.
So the morality of an action comes down to what happens after you do it, the ripple effects.
Exactly. And the trickiest part is figuring out what best outcome even means. Different Act-Consequentialist theories have different ways of ranking potential results.
I'm already getting a sense of how complicated this can get. Can you give us a concrete example to illustrate this?
Sure. Think about Benthamite utilitarianism. That's a classic Act-Consequentialist theory. It says the best outcome is the one with the most overall happiness and the least overall suffering for everyone involved. So you should always choose the action that maximizes this hedonic utility, as they call it, the balance of pleasure over pain.
Right. Utilitarianism, the idea that we should aim for the greatest good for the greatest number. I've heard about it, but I also know it has some pretty counterintuitive implications, right?
Well, absolutely. And those counterintuitive aspects are a big reason why philosophers explore consequentializing other theories. Like a strict utilitarian might say it's okay to harm one innocent person if it somehow leads to a huge increase in happiness for a lot of other people. Or, even wilder, they might justify something like severely limiting someone's freedom if it meant a net increase in overall pleasure for everyone else.
I see what you mean about counterintuitive. Those examples really highlight the potential tension between just focusing on overall happiness and our gut feelings about what's right and wrong.
Yeah, it can get pretty messy. And those kinds of troublesome implications are why philosophers are interested in seeing if we can consequentialize other ethical systems, ones that might not lead to those same uncomfortable conclusions.
So, are there other act consequentialist theories that try to rank outcomes in a different way, one that might be less problematic?
There are. Ethical egoism, for example, is all about maximizing what's best for you, the person taking the action. It says the best outcome is simply whatever benefits you the most, even if it's not the best for everyone else involved.
Well, that certainly sounds more straightforward, but also a lot more selfish.
Yeah, it definitely leans heavily towards self-interest,
Hmm.
which is why it's often seen as a controversial ethical stance. Then there's self-other utilitarianism. This tries to strike a balance between individual and overall well-being. It ranks outcomes based on what's good for everyone else and what's specifically good for the person acting. So it acknowledges that sometimes it's okay to choose an outcome that's slightly worse for everyone overall if it significantly benefits others without harming yourself too much.
It's like trying to find a middle ground between pure altruism and pure selfishness.
Right, exactly. And all of these different variations highlight a crucial point. The real heart of consequentializing isn't about defending utilitarianism itself, but rather exploring whether we can get to similar moral judgments by simply tweaking the way we define a good outcome within an act-consequentialist framework.
Okay, so we're not throwing out the idea that consequences matter, but we're trying to be more sophisticated about which consequences matter most and how we should weigh them against each other.
That's it. And to be clear, consequentializing is distinct from just trying to fix utilitarianism directly. There are other ways to address the problems with utilitarianism. Some philosophers try to keep the act-consequentialist structure, but change the way outcomes are ranked. Like, rights consequentialism, for instance, says outcomes that violate people's rights are inherently worse. And qualitative utilitarianism argues that some kinds of pleasure are just more valuable than others. So it's not just about the amount of pleasure, but also the quality.
So these are still act consequentialist theories, but with a different understanding of what makes an outcome good or bad.
Exactly. And then there are those who keep the emphasis on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, but they abandon act consequentialism altogether. Rule utilitarianism, for instance, says we should follow rules that generally lead to the greatest happiness, even if breaking a rule might lead to a better outcome in a specific case. So instead of judging each action individually, we're looking at the overall effects of following certain rules.
It's like a zoomed out perspective on ethics.
Yeah, you could say that. And some theories even suggest that what counts as a good or bad outcome might depend on the person who's acting. It's all about perspective. And some, like Hooker's rule consequentialism, blend elements from both sides, moving away from strict act consequentialism and having a more nuanced approach to evaluating outcomes.
Wow, so many variations. It sounds like philosophers have really explored every nook and cranny of ethical theory.
They have. And it's important to remember that consequentializing is just one of many tools in the philosophical toolbox. The underlying appeal of consequentializing is that it sticks with the idea that consequences are ultimately what determine right and wrong, but it allows for more flexibility in how we define what a good outcome is. It's about seeing if we can achieve the moral guidance of other ethical systems by simply adjusting our understanding of good within a framework that prioritizes results.
It sounds like consequentializing gives us a way to see connections between ethical systems that might seem totally different at first glance. But where did this whole idea even come from? It feels like it has some history behind it.
It does. Interestingly, the seeds of consequentializing were planted pretty early in the development of act consequentialism itself. Think back to John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. He argued for qualitative hedonism, suggesting that intellectual pleasures like appreciating art or engaging in deep conversations are inherently more valuable than purely physical pleasures, like eating a delicious meal or taking a hot bath. This was an early attempt to refine how we evaluate outcomes within a consequentialist framework.
So even early utilitarians recognized that just adding up units of pleasure might not capture everything that matters morally.
Exactly. And then in the early 20th century, G.E. Moore argued that pleasure isn't the only thing that's intrinsically good. He proposed that things like beauty and knowledge also have value in themselves, regardless of whether they produce pleasure. This opened the door for consequentializers to consider a much wider range of factors when evaluating outcomes. As other philosophers like W.D. Ross later emphasized, this meant that consequentialists could now acknowledge things like good character or justice as good outcomes in their own right, not just as means to producing happiness.
So broadening our understanding of what makes an outcome good was crucial for making consequentializing a more viable project.
Absolutely. And alongside this shift in how we think about good came a broader understanding of what even constitutes an outcome of an action. Early utilitarians tended to focus narrowly on the immediate, observable consequences. But consequentializers realized they could incorporate a lot more into their definition of an outcome, things like the motives behind the action, whether it involves keeping a promise or whether it helps to rectify a past injustice. Nowadays, it's common to think of an outcome as everything that would be the case if that act were performed, not just the immediate causal consequences.
So if you're trying to consequentialize a moral theory that emphasizes promise keeping, you can't just focus on the immediate effects of breaking or keeping a promise in a specific situation. You have to consider the broader implications for trust and social bonds.
Exactly. This wider view of outcome allows consequentializers to argue that certain types of actions, like betraying a friend, are inherently bad as features of an outcome. It's not just about the immediate tangible consequences, but also about the kind of world we create through our actions. This helps them address the intuitive feeling that some actions are just wrong in themselves, regardless of the specific benefits they might produce.
But even if we accept this broader view of outcomes, Common sense often tells us that some things are just wrong, regardless of the overall good they might lead to. Like breaking a promise seems wrong, even if it leads to a slightly better outcome overall, or even prevents others from breaking their promises. How do consequentializers try to grapple with those deeply ingrained feelings about duty?
That's where it gets really interesting. To accommodate these strong intuitions about duty, consequentializers have come up with some clever strategies. One is the idea of evaluator relative ranking of outcomes. What this means is that the person performing the action might rank the potential outcomes differently from a completely neutral observer. So while a bystander might think that two broken promises are worse than one, you, as the person making the promise, might legitimately see it differently. You have special responsibility for your own promises, so you might think it's better to keep your promise even if it means two other people break theirs rather than the other way around.
So it's not just about the absolute state of affairs in the world, but also about who's responsible for which parts of that state of affairs. That makes sense intuitively. What about those situations where it seems like we have a moral choice? We could do the thing that leads to the best overall outcome, but we also feel like it's okay to choose a different path.
These are called agent-centered options, and they're a key challenge for consequentializing. Common sense morality often allows us to choose not to maximize the total good in every single instance. To try to capture this, consequentializers often employ a dual ranking of outcomes. Think about it like this. Imagine you have a headache and you have two pain relief tablets left. Giving both to a stranger would slightly alleviate their more severe pain. Taking both yourself would completely relieve your moderate pain. Overall, giving them away might lead to a slightly larger reduction in total pain. But intuitively, it also seems okay for you to take the tablets yourself. Consequentialized theories that use a dual ranking system try to reflect this. Perhaps they have one ranking that focuses on overall well-being and another that gives some extra weight to the well-being of the individual acting.
So, in the headache example, taking the tablets yourself might be permissible because it significantly benefits you, even if giving them away produces a slightly greater total benefit across everyone involved.
Exactly. This dual ranking approach helps to make sense of what are called agent sacrificing options. Those choices where you benefit others even if it comes at a cost to yourself. But what about the opposite agent favoring options, where you choose to benefit yourself even if it means a slightly worse outcome for everyone else combined?
Like, if you had a limited resource that could either provide a large benefit to you or a slightly larger total benefit if distributed amongst several other people.
Right. That's a tricky one. Some consequentialized theories try to handle this by incorporating a more complex ranking system that allows for some degree of self-preference without completely abandoning the focus on overall good outcomes. But these attempts can sometimes feel a bit forced, like they're bending over backwards to make the theory fit our intuitions rather than flowing naturally from its core principles.
This brings us to the different motivations behind consequentializing. It sounds like it's not just one monolithic project, but a collection of approaches with different goals. You mentioned three types. Let's dig into those.
Yeah, let's unpack that. So the first type is what we call earnest consequentializing. The driving force here is a genuine belief in the core idea of act-consequentialism, coupled with a desire to avoid the widely recognized problems of classic utilitarianism. Earnest consequentializers think act-consequentialism is onto something really important with its emphasis on outcomes, but they want a version that doesn't lead to those morally disturbing implications we talked about earlier.
So they're not trying to defend utilitarianism as it is, but rather trying to salvage what they see as its best features.
That's it. They often present what's called the intuitive argument for consequentializing. It goes something like this. First, there's a strong intuitive pull towards the idea that the rightness of an action is fundamentally connected to its results, to what happens because of it. Second, while utilitarianism takes this focus on results seriously, it often clashes with our other strong moral beliefs about things like rights and justice. Third, non-consequentialist theories might avoid those clashes, but they seem to give up on that initial link between actions and outcomes. And fourth, by successfully consequentializing non-consequentialist theories, we might be able to develop a system that keeps the focus on results while aligning better with our broader moral landscape.
So it's a quest to find a way to reconcile our gut feelings about right and wrong with this core idea that consequences ultimately matter.
Exactly. And a key part of their strategy is the recognition that the same moral data, our intuitions about what's right and wrong, can often be explained by multiple different theories, like Think back to the don't lie example. A utilitarian might say lying is generally wrong because it tends to produce bad consequences. A rule-based ethicist might say it's inherently wrong because it violates a duty to be truthful. Both arrive at the same basic judgment, but their explanations are totally different. Earnest consequentializers are hoping to find act-consequentialist explanations that align with non-consequentialist judgments, but without all the baggage of traditional utilitarianism.
So, because different paths can lead to the same moral destination, they believe they can essentially rebuild non-consequentialist ethics on a foundation of act-consequentialism.
Precisely. And it's worth noting that this kind of theoretical translation isn't unique to consequentializing. You could, in principle, try to do the reverse. You could try to Kantianize utilitarianism by arguing that maximizing happiness is the right thing to do because it aligns with some kind of universalizable moral principle. The point is, the same moral judgments can sometimes be supported by totally different underlying frameworks. The reason earnest consequentializers focus on act-consequentialism is that they believe it has a unique appeal, what they call the compelling idea, that they want to preserve and explore.
Okay, so that's the earnest motivation. What about the second type of consequentializing?
The second type is notational consequentializing, and the goal here isn't necessarily to develop a better or more intuitive moral theory. Instead, notational consequentializers are trying to show that the distinction between consequentialist and non-consequentialist theories might not be as fundamental as we think. They're basically saying that act consequentialism isn't some privileged perspective on morality.
So it's more about the structure of ethical theory itself rather than solving practical moral dilemmas.
Yeah, it's more abstract. They present what's called the assimilation argument for consequentializing. The core idea is that for any plausible non-consequentialist theory, you can always build an act-consequentialist counterpart that will agree with it on every single moral judgment. And if that's true, they argue, then the difference between consequentialist and non-consequentialist formulations is just a matter of how we express the theory, like choosing between Celsius and Fahrenheit for measuring temperature. It doesn't reflect a deep, fundamental difference in the underlying moral principles.
That's a pretty radical claim. So they're suggesting the great divide in ethics might be more about semantics than substance. How do they try to demonstrate that every non-consequentialist theory has this perfectly matching consequentialist twin?
They use something called the Fushion procedure. It's a method for taking any non-consequentialist theory and creating an act-consequentialist theory that will always agree with it on what actions are right or wrong. The trick is to define the ranking of outcomes in the consequentialist theory based directly on what the original non-consequentialist theory considers morally better. So if the non-consequentialist theory says action A is morally better than action B, the Fushion procedure just ranks the outcome of A as better than the outcome of B in the consequentialist version. It's designed to perfectly mirror the original theory's moral judgments in how it ranks outcomes.
So if a duty-based theory says breaking a promise is always wrong, the Fushion-style consequentialist version would simply say that outcomes where promises are broken are always the worst possible outcomes. It's rigged to give the same moral verdicts?
Exactly.
Hmm.
But there's a catch. This perfect mirroring might not always be possible if the way the non-consequentialist theory defines morally better doesn't fit neatly with the logic of ranking outcomes in a consequentialist way. For instance, if the non-consequentialist theory's notion of better leads to contradictions or inconsistencies in certain situations, it can be tricky to create a corresponding ranking of outcomes that makes sense.
So the success of notational consequentializing depends on whether this Fushion mirroring trick can be done for all reasonable non-consequentialist theories without running into logical roadblocks.
That's the challenge. The ultimate goal is to show that all viable moral theories have both act-consequentialist and non-consequentialist versions, suggesting that the choice between those frameworks might not be as profound as we thought.
Okay, that's a pretty head-spinning philosophical project. Now, what about the third motivation for consequentializing? This one sounds more grounded in real-world concerns.
Right, so the third type is pragmatic consequentializing. Here, the motivations are more practical. Some philosophers try to translate non-consequentialist theories into a consequentialist language because they see act-consequentialism as being more compatible with the tools of decision theory, especially when we're facing moral choices with uncertain outcomes.
So it's about making moral theories more useful for navigating real-life situations where we often don't know for sure what the consequences of our actions will be.
Exactly. The pragmatic argument for consequentializing goes something like this. Consequentialist theories play nicely with decision theory, which gives us frameworks for making rational choices in situations where we lack complete information. Non-consequentialist theories, on the other hand, don't always fit neatly into these decision-making models. But if we use the Fuchsian procedure to create an act-consequentialist counterpart of a non-consequentialist theory, we can then apply decision theory to this counterpart to figure out what the original theory would recommend in situations where we're unsure about the consequences. Even if this consequentialist counterpart doesn't perfectly capture the reasoning of the original theory, it can faithfully reproduce its recommendations for action.
So it's like creating a user-friendly interface for a complex ethical system. We're translating it into a language that decision theory can understand so we can get practical guidance.
That's a great analogy. The reason for choosing act-consequentialism here isn't necessarily a deep philosophical belief in its truth, but rather a recognition of its usefulness as a framework for practical moral reasoning in a messy, uncertain world.
These are all such distinct motivations for consequentializing. It's no surprise that there are a lot of arguments against it as well.
Oh yeah, there are plenty of objections, and it's important to keep in mind that some critiques are more relevant to certain types of consequentializing than others.
Let's start with the core claim of earnest consequentializing, that act-consequentialism has a uniquely compelling feature, that compelling idea they keep talking about. Critics argue that this idea might not even exist, or if it does, it's not exclusive to act-consequentialism.
That's a big one. The whole project of earnest consequentializing hinges on this. One suggestion for what this compelling idea might be is the notion that it's always morally permissible to choose your morally best option. But a lot of philosophers point out that this isn't unique to act consequentialism. Most ethical theories would probably agree with that in some form.
So, if the supposed compelling idea isn't actually distinctive, the whole rationale for earnest consequentializing starts to crumble.
Right. Another proposed compelling idea is that it's always morally permissible to choose the option that brings about the best outcome. While this certainly defines act consequentialism, a lot of non-consequentialists find it really unappealing because it clashes with the idea that some actions are simply wrong, regardless of how good their consequences might be.
Like the classic dilemma of lying to a murderer to protect someone's life. Many non-consequentialists would say lying is inherently wrong, even if it prevents a terrible outcome.
Exactly. To try to refine this compelling idea further, some earnest consequentializers suggest it's about always acting to bring about the outcome that's best for you. But critics point out that this relies on a concept of best for you that's difficult to pin down outside of a specific theoretical framework. Others propose that the compelling idea is about acting on your strongest reasons to prefer a certain outcome. This at least has the advantage of explaining why both utilitarianism, preferring overall happiness, and ethical egoism, preferring your own happiness, seem appealing to some people.
Because both, in a way, are telling you to aim for an outcome you have a reason to want, even if they disagree about what should count as a good reason.
Right. But even this idea of acting on your strongest reason to prefer an outcome might not be unique to act consequentialism. Non-consequentialist theories can also be framed in terms of acting for certain kinds of reasons. So it gets tricky. To get around this, some earnest consequentializers have proposed that the really compelling idea is about reasons for preferring ground deontic statuses. Basically, the idea that what makes an action right or wrong is ultimately grounded in our reasons for preferring its outcome over other possible outcomes. This idea is more tightly linked to act consequentialism, but whether it's truly compelling is still up for debate. If earnest consequentializers can't point to a compelling idea that is both genuinely appealing and distinctive to act consequentialism, their whole approach starts to look shaky.
So finding this compelling idea is crucial for their project. Now, what about the objection that some core features of our everyday moral thinking just can't be translated into a consequentialist framework?
This is a big one, especially for notational and pragmatic consequentializers. Their whole approach rests on the extensional equivalence thesis, the claim that for every plausible non-consequentialist theory, there's an act-consequentialist counterpart that always delivers the exact same moral judgments. But there are arguments against this. One involves what are called prohibition dilemmas. These are situations where it seems like every possible action is morally wrong.
Can act-consequentialism even handle that? If rightness depends on the outcome being better than all alternatives, what happens when all the options are bad?
Yeah, it's a puzzle. Some consequentialists have tried to address this with ideas like cyclic rankings of outcomes, where outcomes are ranked in a circular way. But these solutions are pretty controversial. They get complex really fast. If there are aspects of our moral experience that act consequentialism just can't handle, then the claim that every non-consequentialist theory has a perfect act consequentialist twin falls apart, which would be a huge problem for notational and pragmatic consequentializing. Earnest consequentializers, though, have a bit more wiggle room. They don't need perfect agreement with every non-consequentialist intuition. They can use the coherentist procedure, basically adjusting both their outcome rankings and their initial moral judgments to reach a state of reflective equilibrium. They might even be willing to reject some non-consequentialist judgments if they lead to what they see as absurd or nonsensical outcome rankings in their consequentialized theory.
So earnest consequentializers are more willing to say, okay, maybe our initial feelings about this particular moral issue aren't quite right if they make the consequentialist reconstruction too messy or counterintuitive.
Exactly. Their focus is on building the most compelling overall act-consequentialist theory they can, even if it means deviating from some aspects of other moral frameworks.
Another common criticism is that these act consequentialist counterpart theories, the ones created through consequentializing, often feel artificial or gimmicky.
Yeah, that's a common reaction, especially to theories generated using the straightforward Fuchsian procedure. It can feel like you're just slapping a consequentialist label onto a non-consequentialist idea without really explaining anything new. Like if a theory says lying is inherently wrong, the consequentialized version might just say that outcomes where lies occur are automatically bad. It doesn't really give us a deeper understanding of why lying is wrong.
Like saying stealing is wrong because it leads to a stealing outcome and stealing outcomes are bad. It just renames the problem without explaining it.
It's exactly. Notational and pragmatic consequentializers might be okay with this apparent artificiality because they have different goals. But for earnest consequentializers, it would be a big problem if their theories felt like nothing more than a superficial rephrasing of non-consequentialist rules. They want their theories to have a genuine grounding in the value of outcomes. Fortunately, because they use the coherentist procedure, they can try to provide more substantial reasons for why they prefer certain outcomes. For instance, they might argue that outcomes where promises are kept are better because they foster trust and cooperation, which are valuable in themselves, not just because some rule says so.
So the earnest approach is about finding a deeper justification for why we should value certain outcomes, rather than just reflecting the pronouncements of a non-consequentialist theory.
Right. Now, this leads to the objection that consequentialized theories are often explanatorily inadequate.
This feels like it gets to the heart of what makes a good moral theory. It's not just about getting the right answers, but also understanding why those answers make sense.
Exactly. Some philosophers argue that consequentializing puts the cart before the horse. They say the wrongness of an action is what explains why its outcome is bad, not the other way around. Like, the reason we might prefer an outcome where promises are kept is because it's wrong to break promises, not the other way around. Earnest consequentialists push back against this, saying our reasons for action ultimately come from our reasons for preferring certain outcomes.
So they would argue that we prefer an outcome where promises are kept because it aligns with our deeper values and desires, and it's those preferences that make breaking a promise wrong.
Yeah, that's the general idea. But critics point out that consequentializing might force us to give up the most natural and compelling explanations for our moral beliefs. Take the classic thought experiment of killing one innocent person to save 5 others. Some argue that the most compelling reason not to kill the one is their inherent value and right not to be used as a mere means to an end. They worry that consequentializing forces us to frame this decision in terms of our preferences about outcomes, which feels like it misses the point about the individual's inherent worth.
It feels like we're reducing a deep moral principle to a matter of personal preference.
That's the concern. Earnest consequentialists, though, respond by saying they can still acknowledge the inherent value of persons. They can say that our duty to respect persons gives us really strong reasons to prefer outcomes where individuals aren't harmed or treated as mere tools. Those preferences then inform our ranking of outcomes and ultimately our moral judgments. They argue that the key difference between act consequentialism and other theories is what they see as the ultimate basis for moral rightness and wrongness, not necessarily the specific moral conclusions they reach or the initial moral intuitions they take seriously.
So an earnest consequentialist might agree that we shouldn't kill the one to save the 5 because of the individual's inherent value, but they would frame the wrongness of the act in terms of its outcome being ranked lower than an alternative where that value is respected.
Exactly. Finally, there's a critique aimed specifically at notational consequentializers. The claim that simply having an outcome that outranks every other available alternative doesn't necessarily mean that the action producing that outcome is what we ought to do.
This seems to challenge the very foundation of notational consequentialism, the idea that two theories that agree on all moral judgments are essentially just saying the same thing in different ways.
Right, it gets at the heart of that. Philosopher Peter Railton, for example, has questioned whether consequentialism can truly capture the agent's perspective and the sense of obligation that's central to a lot of non-consequentialist theories. The fact that an outcome is ranked highest might not fully explain why we feel we have to bring it about. There might be something more to our sense of moral duty than just maximizing good outcomes.
It suggests that even if different moral theories sometimes lead to the same practical conclusions, they might be working with fundamentally different concepts and principles.
That's a key insight. This whole exploration of consequentializing shows just how complex and intricate the world of ethical theory is. It's not a simple matter of choosing between focusing on consequences or rules. There are all sorts of subtle ways that philosophers try to connect those ideas and understand the deeper structure of our moral thinking.
And the takeaway for you, our listener, is that grappling with this idea of consequentializing gives you a deeper understanding of the relationships and the tensions between different ways of approaching morality. It highlights the fundamental questions that philosophers are still wrestling with about what it even means to be good.
So here's a final thought-provoking question to leave you with. Does the fact that we can even attempt to translate different moral theories into the language of consequences reveal something important about what underlies all our ethical thinking? Does this focus on outcomes and preferences capture some essential element of morality, even if it doesn't capture everything? Or does it miss crucial aspects that are highlighted by non-consequentialist views?
It's a question that really forces us to examine the foundations of our own moral beliefs. And if you're interested in digging deeper into these ideas, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy Entry on Consequentialism is a fantastic starting point. It will point you towards many more fascinating discussions in this area of ethics.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.
And keep questioning everything.